Now, a lot of people find this counterintuitive that you would have to throw the dog over in this case as opposed to the elderly person. I mean, after all, the elderly person is a person. And sure, she's making everybody unhappy, or they are making everyone unhappy, but why is that a good reason to kill them as opposed to the dog? There just seems to be something different about people that makes them more valuable than other kinds of animals. Now, Kantian moral theory has that in spades. Now, what that means is, well, if you were looking for a theory that says there's something unique and special about human beings, Kantian deontology is where it's at. It's our rationality that's unique and special about us. It gives us access to a priori knowledge. In other words, the only kind of knowledge that can only be had by reasoning. The categorical imperative is one of those kinds of things. It's only via our rational natures that we're able to apprehend the moral law and thereby distinguish ourselves from the other kinds of non-rational things which can be used as instruments. But utilitarianism, although reason plays an important part in sort of seeing that pleasure should be equal, because you sort of are asked to think, well, what reason could you give for preferring your pleasures over the pleasures of another person, aside from the fact that they're yours? So reason plays a role there, but ultimately, the thing that matters for the utilitarian is not reason, but suffering. It's suffering that matters. So they're concerned with decreasing the amount of suffering which exists in the world. Now, Mill, who was the godson of Jeremy Bentham and who learned about utilitarianism from Jeremy Bentham when he was very young, he would spend summers at Bentham's house and they would discuss utilitarianism, and Mill took it upon himself to popularize the theory. And you will have recognized Mill from other courses perhaps, because this is John Stuart Mill, who's well known from his social political philosophy and his views about liberty and freedom and so on. And if you revisit those, you'll notice there's a heavy dose of utilitarianism which grounds all of the claims that he makes, especially about freedom of speech and thought and so on. But we'll gloss aside those issues here. Mill thought there was something special about human beings, and that it did have something to do with our rational faculties. But it wasn't merely that we had rational faculties, since you might think a computer can have them. But he thought actually that we were, because of those faculties, capable of a different kind of pleasure, the rational, intellectual pleasures. So intellectual pleasures are the kinds of things which are produced by intellectual activity. Playing chess, thinking about philosophy. Even video games can produce intellectual pleasures. If one is playing a puzzle game, for instance, a crossword puzzle, or some kind of action-adventure game that involves you solving some kind of geometrical arrangement puzzle, something like that, where you have to reason about the various moves that you make and the way the pieces fit together. Those kinds of things provide intellectual pleasures. They are pleasures, Mill thought, of a different kind than the pleasures produced by the senses. So the upshot here is that Mill denies that pushpin is as good as poetry. Intellectual pleasures are better, according to Mill, than the sensual pleasures. They're more valuable, therefore more desirable. Therefore, Mill thinks it's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So take some pig. It has all of its pigly desires satisfied. Suppose that, for instance, it's free, it has as much food as it wants, it's free to roam and do all the pigly things that it wants to do. Every pigly pleasure is satisfied, and no pigly pains are produced. Would you trade your life for that of a fully satisfied pig's? Well, we often joke, a dog has the life. I would love to be a dog. You lay around all day, licking yourself, chasing balls, somebody feeds you, you get scratched. That's the life. But if you had the opportunity and you really had to give up your intellect and really function at the level of an animal, a non-rational animal, would you do it? I, for one, wouldn't do it because reason is, in a sense, what gives added value to my life. And even if I had all of my lower sensual pleasure satisfied, suppose that someone were to just give me a drug that knocked out my reasoning capabilities, but made me sensually all very satisfied. I never had to wonder about anything or think about anything, but all of my needs were met, my bodily needs were met, my appetites were filled. That doesn't seem as though it would be a life that I would choose for myself. Now, Mill thinks that people who say otherwise just haven't had this right kind of intellectual pleasure. So a dog might say, yeah, I'd rather be a dog than think all the time. But that's because a dog has never thought, and we'll come back to that point in a second. So it's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And Mill says it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So the point that he's getting at here is that, well, look, it's better to have rational faculties than not have them, even if you don't have your worldly needs met. And it's better to be Socrates, who's engaged in intellectual inquiry and not have your sensual needs met, than it is to be a person who never does that kind of thing, who never engages in rational intellectual activity, and yet is completely, has all their sensual needs met. So the basic idea here is, if you think about possible worlds, a world where only sensual pleasures were maximized is not as good as a world where only the intellectual pleasures are maximized. And this, for Mill, allows him to respond to Aristotle's criticism of hedonism. What was Aristotle's criticism of hedonism? Well, if you remember, Aristotle thought happiness wasn't pleasure, or should not be identified with pleasure, because it was degrading to human beings. It, in effect, reduced us to the level of animals, Aristotle thought. Pleasure may be a fitting goal for a cow, and its life may not be wasted if it spends it in pursuit of cowly pleasures. But Aristotle thought human beings are ignoring the thing which is distinctively human, rationality, if they're setting as the goal of their life pleasure seeking. Well, Mill says, Aristotle overlooked the fact that rationality gives us access, or produces, I guess would be a better word, a special kind of pleasure. A pleasure that animals aren't capable of. And it's not just the same kind of pleasure as one gets from tasting a really delicious food. It's different when one apprehends the solution to a quadratic equation and one goes, aha, I got it. That's a different kind of pleasure. Not just quantitatively. It's not just more of the same stuff that you had before. See, that was how Bentham did. It was all quantitative. How many, how much, how long. All quantity. Whereas for Mill, there's a different quality. Intellectual pleasures are of a higher quality. They're qualitatively different than the sensual pleasures. And so Mill agrees with Aristotle. If human beings set as the goal of their life and the center of their ethical system sensual pleasures, then they are indeed degrading human beings and reducing our status to the level of animals. But of course, there are these intellectual pleasures, Mill thinks. And because he thinks that, he can say, look, those pleasures have to be counted, and they make us better. They give us a status which isn't the same as other animals, even though their pains and pleasures matter. When it comes to deciding between a sensual pleasure and an intellectual pleasures just count for more. So therefore, you would have to err on the side of the intellectual pleasures. Now, of course, this brings up an obvious question, namely, well, who's to decide? Who says that the intellectual pleasures are better than the sensual pleasures? How do we know that the intellectual pleasures are, in fact, better? Well, Mill's got an answer to this, but in order to see it, let's look at a related question. Suppose that we were wondering which of two wines was better, right? We have these two wines, a 2005 Merlot and a 2010 Pinot Noir. Well, I don't know about wines very much, actually, but just suppose that you had these two things and you don't know a lot about these. How are we going to go about finding out which is the better wine? Well, the first thing we'd want to do is taste both of the wines. You can't make a decision unless you've had both. And of course, the same is true in deciding pleasures. So when you're trying to figure out whether intellectual pleasures are better than sensual pleasures, you need to make sure to have both, right? Of course, if you've only had the sensual pleasures, you're going to say intellectual pleasures suck. And if you've only had intellectual pleasures, you might think sensual pleasures suck too, right? If you only had one wine, not the other, you'll say, well, that one's good, so it's got to be the better one, right? But there's a flaw there. So you need to make sure you've had both. But not only should you have had both, but of course, you've got to really spend a lot of time thinking about the difference in the tastes of these wines and wines in general. And the person who's most suited for this is something like a wine critic. Someone who's tasted a lot of wines, who's really spent a lot of time thinking about wines, and who's able to make subtle distinctions between different kinds of wines, maybe distinctions that you wouldn't have even noticed. Now, Mill gives the same kind of answer here. You find people who have had both kinds of pleasures and who have also thought carefully about the differences between these kinds of pleasures, and you ask what these experts, these critics say, and what they say is probably the truth. And of course, the people who meet this criteria are philosophers. Philosophers not only have had both kinds of pleasures. They enjoy the sensual pleasures, good food, good beer, good company, good conversation, etc., traveling, art, beauty. But they also, of course, enjoy the intellectual pleasures, thinking, strategy, planning. Not only have they had both of these, philosophers, at least some of them, have sat around and carefully thought about the differences between the two kinds of pleasures. And philosophers from the ancient times had argued that the intellectual pleasures were better than the sensual pleasures. So Epicurus, who was a philosopher who lived shortly after Aristotle, ancient Greece, Epicurus was a hedonist, and he gave several arguments that the intellectual pleasures were superior to the sensual pleasures. For instance, says Epicurus, sensual pleasures depend on one's wealth. So if one can't afford tasty food, one doesn't get that pleasure. If one can't afford expensive wine, one doesn't get that pleasure. Now, of course, there are the simple pleasures, but still, even there, those are dependent on external circumstance. You may enjoy a beautiful sunset, but what if you go blind? Whereas intellectual pleasures can be called up on demand. One can always think about Kant, even if one's starving. Not only can they be called up on demand, but they are stable. They last longer and don't have this negative response if you overextend them. So sensual pleasures are well known that if you have too much of them, it causes pain. So for instance, you may really enjoy a certain pizza. It may taste really good, but if you eat too much of it, it causes pain. So sensual pleasures all seem to have this characteristic, namely that if you have too much of them, they cause pain. Whereas intellectual pleasures don't seem to have that problem. So I don't want to get too into the details of the arguments that philosophers have given for why the intellectual pleasures are superior to the sensual pleasures. We can talk about that in the discussion board or in class if you prefer, if you want to. The point here is just to recognize that for Mill, intellectual pleasures are superior to sensual pleasures, and he takes as evidence for that the fact that philosophers have traditionally argued that this is the case, and philosophers seem uniquely qualified to make these kinds of judgments since they have experienced both kinds of pleasures and have spent time reflecting on the differences between them, whereas the average person may have had both kinds of pleasures but often doesn't reflect for extended periods about which of them is better.